Tom Stock, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Elliot. How are you doing?
I am very, very well. Thank you so much for asking. I'm excited to dive into our conversation today. But before we do, can you give the listeners a bit of context about who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. My official title, I'm an HR consultant, but what I like to say is that what I believe is people are the heart of any organization. And so I feel like I have a calling to work with organizations to improve how they structure and formulate themselves in a way that people can feel valued and appreciated and like they can achieve the most out of their potential. And so that's what I like to really focus my time and energy on from the working world perspective. And I've been doing that for over 10 years now, and based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so when I'm not focused on the people element of organizations, I'm really big into anything outdoors, sports, sitting on patios, walking the dog, any number of things. As long as it's outside, I'm happy.
Very nice. I like it. Well, you spend enough time inside, I should imagine, with the work that you do. So it's nice to get that
Yes.
balance of the two. So cast me back to maybe 10 years ago when you're getting into this industry. What leads you to this direction in the first place?
Yeah, great question. And I think for me, I am somebody who's always been a very outgoing social person. I love interacting with people, hearing their stories, meeting new people, and along with that, changing my environment frequently. I like traveling. I like even just within the city that I live in. I like going to different places. And so the world of consulting kind of meshed those two together with a chance to
Mm.
travel the country, travel the world, experience different industries, talk with different people about their experiences. And it really just kind of grew from there organically. But that's kind of what motivated me to look at the consulting industry to start.
And how much has it changed in the past 10 years? I can imagine so much has changed since you entered the world of this in 2013, 2014 to today, where we live in a very different world. We live in a post-COVID world as well. So how much has
Yeah.
changed since you begun?
Oh my gosh, it's a complete 180 from where it was. And I would say twofold to that. The first is the more obvious answer that you alluded to, the post-COVID world where we're all much more virtually enabled than we used to be with regards to doing things like this and how many client sessions, workshops, and anything like that where we can engage in a system like this rather than me having to travel. But the more impactful actually change that I've noticed is how much more, at least, and I'll speak from the United States aspect of the culture, is which we're much more open to discussing the things that we didn't used to be able to discuss. Things like
Mm.
diversity, equity, and inclusion. What makes a good leader? What cultural values do we find that resonate with people? We were having those conversations 10 years ago, but it was more on the periphery and it was seen as that
Mm.
soft language from a lot of corporate executives. And now, fast forward 10 years later, the amount of executives who really see the value in not only having those conversations, but leading those conversations is just blown me out of the water and not something I expected to happen 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's definitely a change for the better. And I'm curious, I will ask you that question a little bit towards the end when we've gone through a little bit more of the leadership side of things, because I'm interested to see how much of each do you think is worth having within a workplace? You know, how much of the focusing on those values is important, and then how much are we too much focused on those values to the point where we're missing the point of the work? So I'll save that question for a little bit later because I think it's quite a
Yeah.
spicy topic. But I want to go back to the leadership side of things, right? Now you just said that obviously a lot of these leaders are starting to talk about these things. They're recognizing that maybe change starts from them, then bleeds out into the remainder of the company. So when it comes to the leadership aspect of things, sometimes it's good to focus on what we're doing correct and what we should be doing more of. But I'm curious to ask the question first, what are people getting wrong about leadership, and where can we correct those things that we're currently making mistakes about?
Yeah, it's a great question and something that is much easier said than done. But I would say first and foremost would be there's a self-awareness aspect to leadership that to me is the first, foremost, and ultimate bedrock of any good leader is how self-aware are they? And the I'm going to speak in generalities, but I'll call it the maybe the more seasoned generation from 10, 15 years ago. They weren't as skilled in the abilities of being self-reflective and kind of first and foremost putting that ahead of everything else before you go and coach somebody or before you go and give constructive feedback or even positive feedback. And so that would be the first and foremost element is how self-aware is a leader and how good are they at controlling those blind spots that might come up without much awareness. So that would be first and foremost my number one thing on that one. The other two, I think, is really around active listening. That's, it's been a bit of a buzzword, I would say, really since COVID. I've been hearing it a lot more, but I think there's a reason for that. And it's because it goes to that notion of so many times, particularly in the corporate culture where people have ideas they cling to, ways of working they're clinging to, that idea of active listening and really hearing not just what's being said, but what also is not being said. Instead of formulating your argument and getting ready to kind of put together your next words, just taking that step back. And then when the person seems like they're done, just kind of saying, okay, tell me more. Just keep letting them open up because we're so trained to, if a person gives us a pause, that's when we want to jump right in and share our own perspectives. And I think letting it be a little bit more open, letting silence be the friend is something that is another great skill. And then the third piece really, I would say, is around how do you set up people for success? So many times when we work with organizations and we work with clients, they might even be good at giving positive or constructive feedback, might be able to kind of share what they want people to focus on, but then they're not fully aware or don't have a great appreciation for the environment with which that person has to do those things and the struggles that they might be going through. So as a leader, being much more aware of what type of environment is set up for that person and are they set up for success? And if they're not, then my number one role as a leader should be to remove those barriers to success. Because I can't ask you to do something and then go remove those barriers yourself. I should be able to spend my time removing those barriers so then I can say, hey, I cleared the path for you. Now you should be good to go do what I need you to do.
Yeah, I love that. I think all of those 3 points could be applied to any human being, regardless if they're a leader in any organization. Absolutely. There's that self-awareness piece, there's the active listening, then there's being that facilitator as well. Even just taking that back into the context of being in a family, right? If you've got siblings, if you've got cousins, if you've got children as well, that would be 3 amazing traits that would be really, really valuable to take into your family life, let alone your work life as well. So can we dig into all 3 of those and talk about some practical ways in which a leader might do that? The self-awareness piece, I can imagine, is a lot of things to do with outside of the work setting, which they need to do on themselves. So do you have some ideas in which you would encourage people? And maybe do you look at this when you're looking at a leader and you're like, okay, which maybe of these 3 are they missing at this moment? Do you pinpoint one of them and maybe say, okay, start with the self-awareness piece or start with the facilitating piece? Where do you go with that in terms of directing them and best practices of where to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my first thing that I engage when I'm engaging with leaders, the first thing I look for is the active listening piece, because it's easier to spot than their self-awareness, just from kind of that first interactions before you know somebody really well. So first and foremost, I kind of look to them. Are they listening to what I'm saying and taking it in, or do I kind of get the sense from their body language that they're getting ready to interject, that they're already, are they distracted with their phones? Are they, any number of things, right? That kind of can visually tell me the cue. Okay, either it seems like you're distracted or you're wanting more to maybe argue the point versus just take it and absorb it and kind of frame it from there. It's not to say that the other two aren't equally as vital. It's just I would say that's the easiest one out of the three when I'm working with leaders who are newer, just to kind of get that sense as to where they are. But I think ultimately, then from that, then that allows me to uh, dive in further with them. And the way I like to do that is really by asking a lot of questions myself.
Mm.
My viewpoint of discussions with people where I maybe want them to find the solution or go a certain direction is, rather than telling them, is how can I ask the right questions where they can start to arrive at that answer through their own
Mm.
answers. So that would be one way that I try and really engage with them first and foremost,
Which is
because
also
I
encouraging self-awareness, right?
absolutely, because you get that practice of, okay, maybe I don't typically ask myself these questions, but this person is. And what I have found, and I'm sure you have found this as well, because it's a very personal thing, is oftentimes, even if you've been thinking it in your own mind, sometimes to say it out loud to somebody can be so much more impactful
Mm.
because you
Yep.
hear it coming out. And that's what I really enjoy, is working with leaders that when they do say the thing that maybe they've been either subconsciously or consciously they've been thinking about for a while, whether it's a career change or a big challenge they've been having, once they have that aha moment because they verbalized it, the level of emotion that you see from people who are sometimes not even very emotional people, but it's just that click that really gets people to then show up in a new vulnerable way that you couldn't have gotten from if I had just told them, "Hey, I need you to be vulnerable."
Yeah.
So that's how I like to kind of approach those types of conversations with leaders, just to see if let's see if we can get you there on your own by me just kind of trying to prompt you and guide you, because ultimately, as a change management practitioner, as I am, that I think is much more impactful when they can arrive at those solutions themselves instead of being directed right to it.
Totally. And we all have those examples, right? Where we come across an insight that maybe a certain situation or someone was able to pull out of us. And it's so much more profound when it came from our own learning and our own discovery than someone telling us, right? And maybe
Yeah.
we can't quite see how valuable it will be. You know, you might tell someone, yes, be vulnerable. And they're like, okay, well, A, I don't really know what this vulnerability looks like. And B, I don't know what impact it's going to have. But when they start to reflect, maybe with a deep question that you ask them in terms of the relationship with your team, and you're like, well, actually, maybe if I showed people what I was going through, they would be more comfortable about opening up about what they're going through, for example. And then it leads to all these other different types of things, right? It's just that one thing that loosens the rest of them and then allows them to see a lot of insights. And like I said, it cultivates that self-awareness piece as well. So I like that a lot. So I want to come on to maybe the characteristics of a leader now as well. Obviously, it's amazing if they're self-aware. It's amazing if they are a good listener and also a facilitator as well. But when I think of leaders, some of the words that come to my mind are someone who's a good decision maker, who is able to manage their time extremely well, who is able to be decisive, who is able to be disciplined, right? Those are the other things that come to my mind. So what are some of the other character traits that you see as something that are essential to all the good leaders that you come across?
Yeah, I liked your list there, and one that I actually want to key in on that I would definitely agree with is the time management piece.
Mm.
Uh, right now, obviously, in the world that we now live in, with so much technology, so much distraction, news,
So
emails,
much. Yeah.
pings, Slack, Teams, whatever it is, text, all that. More and more, I'm finding that people are struggling to manage their own time and own their own time. And so
Mm.
working with leaders to say, like, it is in fact your time that you do own. So you either get to dictate it yourself, or people are going to dictate it to you by putting meetings on your calendars back to back to back to back, right? Or constantly pinging you questions and things like that. And so from a leader's perspective, because of what we talked about with the active listening, the asking insightful questions, the removing barriers for people, my view, but what I've seen is that you can't do those things if you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed from the lack of time that you have. And
Sure.
so those things can't happen uh, as adequately as they need to if you're not creating the time for it. So that time management piece is actually a huge component of leaders. And what it boils down to is a prioritization of where you're going to spend your time. And we find so many leaders in companies who were promoted into leadership roles because they made great individual contributors. They were great at the roles that it took to get up to that point in the ladder. But what we often say is what got you here is not going to get you to the next phase. And that often comes with letting things go that you used to like to work on, that used to be successful working on, because you have to create that space to then focus on those things that a good leader needs to do, like the active listening, like preparing for a meeting with one of your direct reports ahead of time by kind of thinking through what you talked about last time, thinking through prompting questions you might want to ask them, rather than showing up to a meeting and saying, hey, regurgitate the status report. Okay, sounds good. We're good. Done. Doesn't exactly leave the same level of insightful kind of, hey, that leader cares about me and my issues. If the leader themselves isn't making time for themselves to pull back and reflectively think about how they want to approach it.
Yeah, and how do we get ourselves to do that? How do we have the discipline to keep our priorities in check, to maybe essentially like make our time management the priority that it needs to be? Because I think so many people, especially those in leadership positions, they're thinking about what others think about them. So they're working around looking like, I need to look busy all the time. I need to look like I'm doing something. If I'm not stressed and overwhelmed, then maybe I'm not doing enough. And I think that maybe this is what we're talking about in terms of like the change in the way that a leader looks and the change in environment within the work setting now as well, is that, well, A, your team probably doesn't want to see you stressed and overwhelmed, that's for sure. But B, maybe there's a better way to do things. So how do you deal with that? Because I'm sure you come across a lot of leaders who feel that they need to be busy all the time, otherwise they're just not doing enough.
Absolutely, absolutely. That is such a common element that we see because of that fact that when you're, and as well as I'm sure you know, when you're younger in your career, when you're growing through those positions, often you do have to do a lot of extra things to demonstrate that you're capable of going to those next positions. So you start to become accustomed to this idea of the rat race, if you will, right? And feeling busy all the time and volunteering for new things all the time. And it's incumbent on an organization and leaders as a group to define as a group what good leadership looks like. And so to your point, if people care, which they do, obviously, what others think about them, then if there's somebody who wants to drive new leadership behaviors or make time for themselves to be able to focus on those, bring a set of leadership definitions to your cohort or to your supervisor and say, hey, I want to have an honest conversation about how we define what leadership looks like. Because so many times we hear the word leadership, right? And it's just this nebulous thing that exists out there, right? Like we just kind of have this sense of, oh yeah, they're a good leader or they struggle with leader. But there's actual definitions to it. And one of them is, one of the key definitions of good leadership is delegation. So, right. And what does good delegation look like? How do you guide people to accomplish what you want? And say, hey, this thing was going to be mine, but I'm going to take it and make it yours. But I have expectations. Let's talk about that. So I think those types of things is having, kind of building that groundswell within your cohort where you can kind of create a localized culture of leaders, if you will, to say, hey, we took the time to define what delegation looks like, what active listening looks like, what good communication looks like. And now we all are kind of operating from the same lens of definition. And then that allows us to kind of grow it through a groundswell pilot approach, if you will.
Yeah, totally. Because of everyone's working off their own interpretation of what a good leader looks like otherwise, right? actual leader of the team is working based on their interpretation. The team are working based on their interpretation. And it's also
Yeah.
what they see versus what the person actually does. Someone might look like a good leader by calling the shots or making these aggressive remarks in certain meetings. And everyone's like, wow, this person's on point. And then you look behind the scenes and, you know, it always comes to my mind the duck who's like floating on water, but beneath it's going like this, going crazy with his feet, right? And I think that that's the reality of the situation. It's like, it's not just about looking like a good leader, it's having a defined understanding by your entire company. And that can be probably slightly different for each and every company, I should imagine as well. A leader in some company might look different in another. And then just making sure that everyone is actively working towards that, specifically the people at the top of the organization, I should imagine. So coming on to the people at the top of organizations, you mentioned there are some people who obviously get promoted through the ranks because they're very, very good at what they do. And then they become a team leader and now they have to lead the team versus doing the thing that actually got them to that position in the first place. And I find that a lot of people get stuck in that position because they're like, well, actually, when I was just doing the work that I really liked, I felt like I was thriving more. Now I feel the pressure of everyone looking at me, needing to, you know, navigate people's emotions and communicate, etc. When I was actually just very happy doing the work that got me here in the first place and that I loved. So is everyone meant to be a leader, or do you think some people would be better off just staying in the position that they are, that they truly were enjoying prior to be giving all this responsibility? Or do you think we get too trapped in this kind of idea of the rat race? And like you said, we need to climb the ladder in order to be at the very, very top. Whereas I think, you know, could people be a lot happier and a lot better off just staying where they are?
100% agree. See that all the time. The folks who get promoted and then they're miserable, right? Because they just didn't understand the human element that would be pulling at them every day.
Yeah.
And I think it's a twofold answer to your question, which is, you know, should everyone be a leader or should some people stay back? I believe everyone has the capability to be a leader. It's
Sure.
They're learned behaviors that you can learn. So I do believe that everyone has the capability. I think it goes to how do we define leadership, right? So if we have better definitions for, hey, once you get to this level, that's what we classify as a leader, and that's what this looks like. It becomes less about quantifiable metrics on the daily and more about long-term human growth metrics like performance and satisfaction and things like that that are more subjective and not measured every single day in that same way as making a widget, if you will. So I think defining those leadership qualities and competencies will help people better understand what's going to be required of that next level. And then I think you can then have the conversation in more of a data-driven way to say, well, let's have a conversation about what your skills and capabilities within those leadership dynamics are today. And okay, if they're here and we want them to be here, do you individual want to make that learning trajectory to get there? Because that ultimately is the culture we're trying to drive, is leaders who are invested in these competencies and skills and capabilities? Or would you rather go down a subject matter expert track, which is still going to give you just the same amount of pay and respect and title bump and all of that, but allows you to not have to deal with that human element should you be somebody that doesn't want to do that? So I think it's really just how do we better define it and then drive that conversation proactively to say, now that we've defined it and you've got a map here of what it looks like, is this something that you really want? Or is it more because the title and the pay, which, oh, by the way, we can take care of in a different track right over here?
Yeah, I think that's crucial, but that comes from the people at the top, right? They need to create those systems so that people can go into those positions, because if otherwise they will get caught in kind of the first is the argument of the golden handcuffs, in the sense of, okay, this position means more money, and usually there isn't anything higher, right? When someone's like a senior in their company, it's like, okay, well, the next stage is director. There's nowhere else to go but director, so I need to be going here. And then the other side of it is also the title, right? Everyone wants their title to say the best possible thing on LinkedIn, right? They want to be called the director. They don't want to be, you know, executive manager or whatever that might be. So there's a little bit of ego in that as well. So I think you bring up a really good point there. People need to create these new roles for people and these new pathways to people. And something that came to my mind, I don't know how good of this would be an idea, but maybe trial periods where maybe the person gets compensated for this as well, to give them not just the responsibility with no actual reward for the person doing this, but saying, okay, well, for 3 to 6 months, you are going to be trialing this position to see how you feel within it. And if you don't love it by the end of it, you go back to the job that you were doing before, and we either look to move someone else into this position, or we hire externally, or something along those lines. Do you think that would be a potential good idea for someone to actually get realistic ideas? Maybe they don't even know if that would be good until it really hits home.
No, absolutely, 100%. We like to call that stretch roles, if you will, where it's kind of, yeah, but it's the exact same thing that you described. Really, it's let's give you a little bit of a run. We're going to kind of loosen the leash, if you will, to say we're going to give you some more room to run and see how you like it, and we'll have regular conversations and touch points to hear about what you're learning, what you like, what you don't like. And if we're kind of progressing through that with regular touch points, and then we can kind of have a summary overview towards the end of that pilot, initiative or
Hmm.
stretch role, then to your point, 100%, then we can have a more nuanced conversation about, does this make sense for you? Do we need to have a different conversation about what that looks like at the organization? And if so, how do we ensure that we've got people growth capabilities that allow our company to be flexible and agile like that, so that
Yeah.
maybe I did try and then it turns out that, yeah, I didn't really enjoy all the performance conversations. It turns out that I'm more focused on getting the work done, less on how people are doing. Well, then that's okay. Let's make that conversation okay. And I think to your point, it does still require a larger mind shift within corporations to allow that test trial period to run, and then allow it to be okay if somebody goes through it and says, not for me, but I still love this organization. I still want to be here and grow here. I just want to grow maybe a different way than the one way I thought that was out there.
100%. And I think, if anything, it seems like one of those things that will require a lot of time, a lot of restructuring compared to what's traditional. But in the same sense, usually you end up losing your best talent in that position by putting them in this managerial role. So actually, it's a bonus if you think about it. Maybe it's easier to find someone who's able to come into that managerial role than it is to find someone who's the very, very top at what they do. That's the reason you're promoting them in the first place. Maybe they've been in the company from day one, right? And they work their way up and they're most senior in that position. Then finding someone who's got their same level of experience, knows the brand inside out, trying to replace that person might be very, very difficult. Whereas getting someone, kind of senior in a managerial role who maybe you can shape and doesn't necessarily need to know that designated thing as much and just needs to manage people more, is potentially easier to find than losing your best person to put them in a job that they're not actually as good as compared to what they were doing before.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because not to your, and it's a great point, because to your point, not only might you lose that one person who wasn't as satisfied after that, but we know from data that says that people leave jobs because of bad managers. So not only
Mm,
could you maybe have
yeah.
that manager leave, but you could also be risking a team leaving because you didn't place the person that should be in that role in the right role, and then those downstream consequences do start to filter through. And
100%.
one of the things that I see with organizations that are really good at managing talent and have a leg up on other organizations is because whether a role is open internally or externally, any role that's open, that company sees it as a way to fill a talent gap that aligns with their cultural attributes that they're trying to achieve. So they recognize that every opening is another step on that journey to better achieving the culture that they're trying to drive. And that really then gets at to what you and I have just been talking about, which is, how do we step back and have the right conversation with the right people who are interested in that role, who can help us grow the culture that we're trying to grow. So it's 100% you're spot on with your thoughts there.
Great. Yeah, and that's great for the understanding. And we are now kind of edging into the world of hiring, which is a really, really difficult thing for many organizations and companies, creating the right culture for the team, bringing in the right person. I mean, it can be make or break, right? It can sometimes be really easy to find the right set of people to get started with a company. But obviously, as it expands, as it grows, I've seen this in companies that I've worked for as well in the past where, at first the process of getting into that company was extremely high, and then it gets very, very low, and then that slightly starts to change the culture of the team. And you're growing, you're expanding, you want to make more money, so you don't mind losing a little bit of what made you you initially in order for the growth. But then you start to lose your identity, and then it becomes a little bit of a mess to try and bring things back together because you brought so many people in for growth that you are now not able to control the culture quite in the way that you wanted to. So when it comes to hiring the right people, especially during a phase of expansion, how can we make sure that we are bringing in the right people and making sure that the culture and the values of the team are being embedded in these new people from the very beginning? Maybe if they don't already have them, how do we make sure that they are coming into a team where everyone's living and breathing that? And if they do have them, how can we make sure that they really instill that from the very, very beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I think it's a multifaceted approach, but to boil it down, I'd say first and foremost, it comes from taking time to define what are the cultural attributes of the organization. What is that secret sauce, if you will? And that becomes your employer value proposition, if you will. That's like, hey, this is why you would want to come work for us, because we do enable great leaders, or we have amazing development programs that walk you through every facet of what you need to do, and we invest in you because then ultimately we get better returns for that. Something like that, you can then take and market all over strategically depending on what you want to do. If you can work with educational institutions or industry groups to really get that word out. And when it comes to kind of attracting that level of talent that you're trying to get to, you have to see it as a long-term game. So it's less about the transaction. Oh, we've got open roles over here. We've got open. That will always be the case, right? There will always be open positions in different areas. But it's more about what's that long-term sourcing plan that we've got from a talent perspective. Maybe we work in an industry where it's tough to grow talent because a lot of people don't see our line of work as exciting. Okay, well then that means we have to start really early. So we maybe need to start partnering with junior highs and high schools to get people interested and do apprenticeships and things of that nature. So there's a number of creative ways that you can do it, but it all has to come from that vein of you have to look at talent from that long-term view, that you're building something that is ultimately bigger than you as an individual within an organization. And if you think about it in that lens, you can then set up these programs and these relationships with organizations or institutions that will feed you that talent long-term. It takes a little bit of work to set that up for sure.
Yeah.
But it pays dividends in the later rounds when you've got talent already primed and ready and in your pipeline versus having to panic because now you need butts and seats in order to produce the thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like that. It's a very long-term view and a long-term perspective. But I think a lot of people want people who are essentially out of their studies with 10 years of experience. You hear that a lot, right? They want the experience, but they also want them to be young, fresh, and ready to work. And that might be the way to get around it, to create these initiatives where there's internships, where there is an ability to work with a company nice and early. That's where you might get someone who understands the culture, who understands what they're doing, and could come into the company with a little bit more experience than they would do just off the back of a college education. So I like that longer term vision approach. Maybe it's quite a hard one from an implementation standpoint, and a lot of companies might think that they're utilizing a lot of resources. But when you look at sports, for example, I'm a big soccer fan, as you call it over there in the US. Like they are finding kids who are 3-4 years old, and they are in their academy, in their system, until they go pro in their later teenage years, right? So they are essentially fostering those. Some they will let go of in the process, some will move, but they are literally thinking, okay, well, this kid is about 4 years old right now, but in 15 years, he actually might be one of our stars. And at least he will know the culture from the very beginning. So maybe they need to be looking at sports from that perspective and looking at the level of dedication that they apply to the children so that they essentially become that big stars in the future.
I love that analogy. That's huge. I'm a big sports fan myself, and you brought it up perfectly because you look at Cristiano Ronaldo, Wayne Rooney, even David Beckham back in the day. To your point, they were groomed from a very young age with these organizations who were recognizing their talent when the rest of the world thought they were crazy for looking at a 12-year-old, and almost, in some cases signing them to $1 million contracts when they were that young.
Yeah.
But it's because they saw the potential, because they set up that strategic pipeline. So I love the sports analogy, and I think I'm probably going to steal it from you.
No, it came to my mind just now because I'm an Arsenal fan, and I think of one of our star players at the moment who's Saka, and he's been in the system since he's a child. They show him signing the contracts when he's like 5 years old, 7 years old, and now he's not a player that they had to go and spend 100 million on like you have to in sports these days. He literally came through the system. Yes, you're paying him a lot of wages, and yes, you put a lot of money into his development, but based on his loyalty and based on his understanding, A, he's performing for you now, so he's paying you back on those years that you invested in him, and B, he's probably not going anywhere because of look how much you've put into him. And yes, sometimes in sports it's not always that exchange of loyalty. The club gave you 10 years and you give them another 20. It's not always the case, but generally speaking, people know who invested in you. They know that you took that time, and when it pays off, it pays off.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And the other aspect that I like to your sports analogy there too is when they're recruiting those kids, right? They're still kids. They're not fully developed yet in their muscles and all that. The club knows that. They're thinking, yeah, we're getting you for your potential. We'll take care of that, building your muscle, getting you to understand the plays and all of that. And I think organizations have to think about it the same with even the level of requirements that they think are required to do the job. Yeah, maybe one specialty might require a college degree, but can you grow people with just high school degrees into that specialty where then long term you can say, hey, we actually now looked at this role. We don't actually believe it does require a college degree. What it requires is more of a high school degree, and then we can kind of take care of the rest of that by growing them to be what we need them to be. So I love that analogy. I love the sports analogy again, because it just really works with that idea of thinking creatively about the talent that you need. And it's not expecting that you're going to get perfection in every source of talent that you acquire. It's no, does the person have the potential and the capabilities that we need? And then it's our job to grow them into what we expect them to be, not to just acquire them and have it all, fit in like a piece of a puzzle.
100%. And what we're recognizing now is that millennials are different from boomers, and Gen Z are different from millennials. And, there's a big shift in this culture of people remaining in the same company for years and years on end, right? When you were a boomer, or even kind of one of those earlier millennials, you probably had this understanding that you would stay with a company for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, however long you were going to stay there until you retired. These days, it's completely different. And I wonder if potentially that's a solution to that situation. If someone knows the organization inside out and they're like, well, actually, I've been here all my life and I actually really like it here. And also maybe the company can pay me more than they would typically pay a 18 or 21-year-old because they know what I can already do. That could be another solution because if I've spoken to other people in the past, and I've had teams in which I've led before from a coaching perspective, and a lot of the people were saying to me is like, if you wanted to hire someone with experience, just expect a good 1 or 2 years, and then they might end up leaving you. But at least you got the good 1 or 2 years out of them. But this could be a way to say, well, actually, maybe we need to pick from a lot younger with someone with potential, so that solves our solution of keeping people on the team. Because if you keep someone longer, you can create a better culture because you have those people who are here from the start. They know what it was like from ground zero. And if you don't have a lot of those people, then that's when identity can get lost.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a great call out because I think we often focus on the younger talent coming up, and that's obviously important, and there's a reason for that. But just as important, to your point, is those people who are more seasoned within an organization. who have the war stories of years
Yeah.
past, right? And have the context about why things are the way they are. And I think as long as you can find those types of people who also have the mentality to say, yeah, that's the way we've done it in the past because of A, B, or C. But hey, I'm willing to give this new thing a change and
Mm.
work it into a new system, then you're going to find a great balance there, to your point, of younger talent that's hungry for growth, right? Hungry to learn, and you're going to have a more seasoned group of people who can be willing to share their knowledge, share their insights, their lessons learned, and then the cross reference teaching and learning that can happen can really then help enable a really healthy culture, and something where I think ultimately then you find a lot of people who would enjoy working cross boundaries, cross cultures, cross age groups in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've touched on a few things that I think would help this next question. But a big frustration, I think, for a lot of leaders and a lot of people at the top is when they hire, especially when a team is maybe a little bit smaller as well, it's very hard to find people with a level of work rate in which matches the person in charge. And I've been told before that never expect anyone to work as hard as you, especially if it's your business, because naturally you are going to work harder. But at the same time, there might be an element of, we look at Gen Z, a lot of people say, they're lazy, they don't work as hard as millennials did, for example. But then there's Gen Z saying, well, we've got hundreds of different options now. We can be a YouTuber, we can be an influencer if we want. So what makes me want to work hard in this sense? So when it comes to creating a team that has this good work ethic, especially when it comes to the younger generation who can kind of be inspired by the leaders, where do you go about that certain situation of trying to get them to that level where we have people who are continuing to put in the work ethic required to grow a company, but not also getting the expectation that they should work as hard as the person at the top of the organization?
Yeah, it's a good call out. Certainly in today's day and age, when
Mm.
burnout is a topic of conversation, for
Yeah.
that very reason. I think one of the things that I like to do with clients that I work with is to develop what we call a people strategy, and really it's a way to look at how do we want people to engage and grow with this within this organization. And one of the reasons that it's important to do that is because what you get a chance to do is to tie people's roles to the overall purpose and mission of the organization. And I think you can motivate people to do any number of things if there's a conversation around how what they do matters.
Mm.
If you think, oh, I'm just being asked to do this because my boss doesn't have time to do this, or this doesn't mean anything, or I don't have the context, so it's just singular in my mind, I'm going to approach that a lot differently than if somebody takes the time to not only ask me to do something, but says, here's how what you're going to do relates to what Susie over here is doing, relates to what Jim over here is doing. And what we're going to do is try and combine these in what look like individual elements to create something bigger. And then that affects this part of the overall business strategy over here. So now you, individual player, feel much more tied to, oh, I'm actually working on something that's important, that has visibility to it,
Mm.
that has an ability to shape what we're trying to do as a company. So having the contextual conversation about why is what you're doing or why is what I'm asking to do important, and by doing that, that'll really, I think, frame a lot of the mindset shifts. And then therefore, because I think to your point with the Gen Z, it's not that they're lazier or anything like that. They just they've been surrounded by technology, smartphones all their lives. So
Yeah.
work to them just looks a little bit different, but it's a lot of work to be an influencer, much more than people understand it to be. So I know for a fact that they're willing to work hard, but it's got to be because they
Yeah.
believe in the overall purpose and objectives of it, not just because somebody said to do it. So I think it's just about sharing that communication, sharing that insight. And I think you'll be really amazed at what you can get people to do if you just let them in on the bigger picture.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And is that harder to do in a remote setting? I can imagine it's a little easier to create team culture, to show the importance of what you do. But I know many people who've gone into companies, this is maybe casting our minds back to like 2022, for example, and they got recruited sometime during the lockdown and they never even met their colleagues, never even met their boss in person, right? That we weren't able to do those things. So is it much, much harder? And is there anything you can do more if you're someone who has just come into the team who's completely remote and hasn't even met their team?
Yeah, it's a great call out because you're right. There's a whole generation of the workforce, right, that's never had to go into the office still to this
Yeah,
point.
it's crazy.
I would say it is crazy, yeah. Uh, and I would say to that, I don't want to necessarily call it harder, but what I'll say is that it requires that purposeful thought. So it ties it back to what we were talking about a little bit ago with that leadership ability. That if I want to be a good leader, I have to dictate how I'm going to spend my time. And that requires that I then be more purposeful about getting in touch with those employees to say, hey, let me
Mm,
spend a little bit of time walking you through why this is important, how this relates to what your teammates are doing over here, how this relates to what those above you are doing. So it's not necessarily that it's harder in and of itself. It just requires a different level of focus, which can be achieved if you take the time to kind of step back and prioritize your time in a way that is about those that you're leading. But it will become a lot harder if you let your calendar dictate your schedule, because then you're left with trying to squeeze that in between all the other things. So I would say it's just more about the journey that we're all on together, which is kind of learning what this new remote/hybrid world looks like.
yeah.
And it does require a level of thoughtfulness in your approach that we just still aren't used to, I think, from a broad perspective. But if you do take the time to do it, I think one, practice helps because you'll get more practiced at it. So it'll become easier. You'll have more of a sense as to what it really takes to do that. And two, then you're setting the expectation as a leader that, hey, taking a step back, having those contextual conversations is important in this organization. So when you, my direct report, have to go off and do that maybe in a year or two when you've grown in your role, you'll kind of be thinking that same way because you were trained from your supervisor to say, hey, yeah,
Yeah.
it's important to take a step back and say, let's have a conversation about what we're really doing. Let's show it how it paints into the broader picture. And then that kind of helps everyone accomplish that shared goal.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I want to come back to a question that we were going to touch on earlier when we were speaking about culture, diversity and inclusion, and all of these different things that we have to discuss as a company who exists in 2024, right? These things are super, super important. It seems, again, to touch on Gen Z, as if they are at least more vocal about caring. I don't know if they care any more than millennials or boomers, but they are at least a lot more vocal about these things. Discussions around burnout, discussion around mental health, all these different types of things that we have to navigate in a modern setting. And my question is to you, how much are we putting a focus on this in a good way to the point in which we are instilling these things and it's really, really helping the workforce and helping people's health, more importantly, and big cultural issues as well? And how much of this is distracting us from the work that should be done? Do you think that there's a little bit of a conflict between the two? Because I think that there may be a little bit of an overcorrection. I don't know what it looks like right now, but I know, especially off the back of the lockdown situation, there was a big overcorrection in terms of mental health and burnout. And I don't know where we stand now in terms of what's actually productive and is this taking away from the big purpose of what a certain organization might want to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. I think spot on with that because, right, ultimately, money drives everything, right? So at the end of the day, an organization's got to make money. They've got to produce the things or provide the services to make money. So you're right. You can't have the burnout conversations or the empathy conversations and ignore that aspect of it. I think I think what it really is, and to your point, I agree that I think there's a both conversations can be held together, and I think it's just about finding that equilibrium. I think where it really starts is okay. Let's define the critical work, and let's have a conversation about how do we accomplish that work. Maybe there's smarter ways to accomplish the work than what we're doing now, which could help us prevent burnout. Like obviously everyone else in the world right now thinking a lot about generative AI and how do we leverage that to help take care of a lot of those smaller things that while they're smaller things, they add up to be a decent amount of our day. And that does sap from our energy. So maybe there's ways that we can leverage those types of technologies to automate some of those things where we can, and then ultimately provide us with more time to just straight up focus on the important things that we need to focus on. Because I think where a lot of the burnout comes from is trying to balance focusing on the urgent and the important together. And how do we leverage technology to automate a lot of the urgent things that we can so we can focus on those important things? Because when we can focus on the important, what we see is that the burnout factor does actually go down. But it's because of those urgent things keep popping up and keep getting in our way that's where it really drives that burnout. So I think if we kind of look and see where we can leverage technology to kind of solution for us, would be one. And the other aspect, the other component that I would say is transparent conversations. Right, like we're humans, right? So one week we might not be burned out. The next week we might be more burned out, or 1 month and the next month, right? Because a lot of it depends on what's happening outside of our working world as well that contributes to that burnout. So I think having those regular touch points where people can feel open to kind of share what's going on, and not so much from a therapy sense, but more from a sense of, hey, I'm feeling like I got 20 different things. They're all saying they're top priority, but you can't have 20 top priorities. You do have to, have a first, second, third, right? And just, and it does take a little vulnerability in that aspect, but it's something that I personally do myself to go to my boss and say, hey, I need help prioritizing what should be my first, second, third. Because I got 10 people all coming to me saying that their thing is the highest priority. So can you just take a step back with me, help me prioritize this, and then I can just go focus on it. And if we come to that conclusion and I still look at it and I say, there's just no way I can get this all done in the timeframes that people have set, let's have a conversation about how do we get me support or how do we change those timeframes. So I think it's just about that transparency and that willingness to be vulnerable enough to say, hey, look, I'm struggling a little bit. I can get back on the right path, but I just might need some guidance on how to do that. So that would be kind of what I would say from what I've seen work well over the past year or two as we've still kind of been learning this new reality.
Absolutely. And I think the reality of the situation is it's not usually the work that causes the burnout, right? It's the intensity of the work. It's the amount of work. It's the conversations around the work. It's the unhad conversations around work as well, right? And obviously, like you said, a lot of outside external factors that obviously compound with all of the requests that we're having. So it's interesting that, if you actually put someone in a position where they're just focusing on the key projects that they need to, and their workload is in accordance to maybe pushing them a little bit, depending on what projects you've got on, what deadlines you've got on, but enough to where they're in a level where they just don't feel bogged down by things, but they feel empowered enough to actually get those things done. Not as if, okay, I needed to do this yesterday, so I'm fighting a losing battle already. I think that's really powerful as well. So, Tom, I think this conversation has been unbelievably enlightening. So I really appreciate your thoughts on all things leadership and all things work world as well. So I want to wrap up with a final couple of questions. And the first one is, what impact do you want to have on the world with the work that you do?
Ooh, that's a big question. But to be put on the spot and think about it in real time, I would say I want to be known for helping to make organizations be the force for good that I personally believe they can be. I'm lucky enough that I've seen it firsthand that I believe that organizations that are well intentioned, both through their public mission and statements, as well as the way that they structure their employee experience, they really can change the world because of the experiences that they either give their customers or their employees. And it really can shape the way that we look at things. So I just want to help be even a small part of that conversation to move the needle more forward, so that we can achieve that vision that corporations can not only be a vehicle for shareholders and stakeholders, but can also just be a vehicle for improving the world around us if we're thoughtful enough about it proactively.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I feel that you are very, very much encouraging that mission, if not beginning to accomplish it based on the conversation today. And where is the best place for people to find you if they want to keep up with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, best place to find me is on LinkedIn. If you go to linkedin.com/Thomas Stuck, that's my individual profile. And got a lot of videos out there where we spend about 5 minutes a time kind of talking about this very thing. Tried to produce some slideware too, so people don't have to stare at my ugly mug the entire time. But no, I mean, but I'm always happy to reach out on LinkedIn and connect and have more conversations like these. So if any of your listeners find this interesting, by all means, I'm happy to have additional conversations on it.
Amazing. Tom, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Elliot. Likewise.